Just 8 days after the Confederate takeover at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, the Civil War erupted in Missouri when Clay County and Jackson County secessionist militias forced their way into the Union Arsenal at Liberty, Missouri. Sometimes called the Missouri Fort Sumter, it left the St. Louis Arsenal as the only other federal military arsenal in the entire state, and it ignited events in St. Louis and around the state that would make Missouri a hotbed of Civil War skirmishes in the first few months of the war. Historian Daniel Gonzales takes us to Missouri in the spring and summer of 1861.
There's an attack on Liberty Arsenal on the other side of the state, and here in St. Louis, forces are kind of positioning themselves, both Unionists and Confederates are positioning themselves to control the St. Louis Arsenal, which is the largest arsenal in the state. And the conventional logic is if you could control the arsenal, you could control the state of Missouri. So we talk about it as the prize. And here you have actually two crates that were actually at the St. Louis Arsenal at the time, and several examples of weapons that would have been there, rifle muskets and sabers, officers' sabers that might have been used. So Governor Jackson has the militia muster in St. Louis. They muster in Lindell Grove, which is actually where St. Louis University is now. So they muster, and this is actually not an abnormal thing to have the militia muster. In a lot of ways it was a social gathering. You know, they'd go and they'd march and they'd drill, and afterwards they might go have a beer with their friends. But this one was different because of the tensions that surrounded it, because of this heightened situation. So when this militia musters, they start naming the streets of the encampment after Confederate generals. There's suspicions that they have brought weapons in from the Confederacy. And certainly there is a pervasive secessionist sentiment within the camp. So this gentleman here, General Nathaniel Lyon, he makes the decision, in the absence of his superior officer, to capture Camp Jackson. He sees it as a insufferable thing that Lincoln had called out for these troops. He called out for tens of thousands of troops, and Missouri had the gall to muster all of these troops in St. Louis instead of sending them to support the Union war effort. So for that reason and these other suspicions of secessionist activity, Nathaniel Lyon takes these largely German troops that have been mustered into federal service, and he surrounds Camp Jackson and captures it. And this man, General Daniel Frost, surrenders Camp Jackson. He's horribly outnumbered. He really has no choice but to surrender. And so they start to march troops back to the U.S. Arsenal, these captured militia troops back to the U.S. Arsenal with the plan of having them sign a loyalty oath to the Union and paroling them. Well, things don't go quite as planned as they're marching back through the city. A mob starts to form. People start to throw rocks, and like a lot of these stories, we don't really know who fired the first shot, but somebody fired a shot, and ultimately almost 30 people were killed in the ensuing melee. So after Camp Jackson, you have a meeting between some of these most important people in the state. This image depicts the meeting which took place at the Planter's House Hotel. You have General Nathaniel Lyon here, who has taken over control of Union forces within the state. And Frank Blair, who I talked about, had been that gentleman who organized Unionist forces in St. Louis in particular. You have Claiborne Jackson, the governor of the state, and General Sterling Price, who had taken control of the Missouri State Guard, the secessionist Missouri militia. And at this meeting, they go back and forth. They're discussing the Unionist side wants Missouri to recognize the authority of the federal government in the state and to provide troops to support the Union to the best of their efforts. The Missouri State Authority, Governor Jackson, General Sterling Price, they want a temporary peace. They want to be left alone. This is kind of an impasse. neither side is willing to agree to what the other one wants. And so finally, Nathaniel Lyon rises from his seat and points at everyone in the room and says, "I would rather see you, and everyone, man, woman, and child throughout the state dead than to surrender to the authority of the state for one more minute." And he says, "This means war." And this, for me, is the moment when the war really begins in earnest. Governor Jackson flees back to the Capitol, and from that point on, the state government is in exile. He talks about being a governor in the saddle. And Nathaniel Lyon follows closely behind in pursuit. And so they fight at several small skirmishes before having a large conflict at the Battle of Wilson's Creek near Springfield, Missouri. There, state militia is joined by Confederate forces under General McCulloch, and they fight. This painting depicts Nathaniel Lyon being killed, one of the earliest generals to be killed in the war. And ultimately, this is a Union defeat, and it leads to the largest incursion and control of Missouri by Confederates. Much of the western portion of the state comes under Confederate control for a short period. Eventually, at the Battle of Pea Ridge, Confederates are defeated. This is in Arkansas, and they're forced to retreat back to safer lines. But this is really one of the largest battles at Wilson's Creek. And it really kind of sets in place this idea that this is going to be a long, bloody, protracted conflict, and that Union forces are not ready, they don't have the things ready to deal with the amount of casualties, the number of orphans and widows that are created by this violence.